Hello, my darlings. Welcome back to Lessons from the Attic, where we talk about books and stories and ghosts and mysteries and all of that fun stuff. Today, we're going to talk about The Canterville Ghost by Oscar Wilde, who's one of my favorite authors, and a Libra like me. I love the story just from the get-go, but let's dive in. So what I thought today was that we would do a little overview. We will talk about some themes in the story, and then I will tell you my overall thoughts about it. So, but of course, I probably will mix my thoughts everywhere. So, The Ghost of Canterville is a very short story, almost like it's like a short story, written by Oscar Wilde and published in a magazine. It has this influence from fairy tales and Gothic novels, which were both in this big revival in the late 19th century, where Oscar Wilde was writing. He obviously wrote fairy tales and Gothic stories, so he's a character, he's a writer and someone who fascinates me because he proves my point. Because I have an argument about how the 19th century, the late 19th century, saw the revival of fairy tales and also of Gothic fiction. So there was this Gothic revival and this consumption of fairy tales by the public. You had the Grimm brothers, and then you had Hans Christian Andersen, but you also had many authors like Oscar Wilde, like Charles Dickens, who were publishing fairy tales as well, or their versions of fairy tales. So I feel like both of them are connected. When I did my thesis in college, I talked about the fairy tale element of Great Expectations that for me belongs to the Gothic revival of the 19th century, but I never thought about the fairy tales and the Gothic revival going together. They seem like separate movements, but now that I'm thinking about it, I keep thinking that they function so well together. And in The Ghost of Canterville, I feel you can see both of them because it is a Gothic story, it is haunting, but it's filled with fairy tale elements. It's not a horror story. It doesn't even have terror, right? It is satire. It is funny, but the satire itself is not that complex. I feel like it's very graspable, meaning that it's easy to understand what Wilde is trying to do. So I feel like it's just very consumable, right? It's a fairy tale. You can read it like a fairy tale. Even though the ghost talks about whatever he's been doing, there's not that horrific element to it. And, one of my favorite things is that the ghost actually gets more scared than the rest of the people in the house. So the whole story centers around the Otis family, who are this modern American family, middle class, with a lot of money because he's a minister. And Mr. Otis has his wife, Lucretia. He has his daughter, Virginia, his son Washington, and the Stars and Stripes, which are his twins. And they all move into this house that is an old country home from a distinguished English family, right? British family, the Cantervilles. And Lord Canterville sells it to Mr. Otis, and he tells him, look, this place is haunted. In like the first opening pages, paragraphs of the story, he tells him like, oh, this place is haunted. And to Mr. Otis is like, I don't believe in ghosts, first of all. I'm a modern man and I'm an American, so if there is a ghost, we'll put him in a museum or we'll find a way to capitalize from it. And so he buys the ghost and the house, and the family moves in and they start experiencing this supernatural presence in the house. And then we switch to the perspective of the Ghost of Canterville, and who is Sir Simon, who was the man who murdered his wife in the house, and he owned the house before. And later we find out by the end of the story, Sir Simon has been trying to like hunt and scare the Otis family away, but he encounters that the Otis family are always trying to solve his problems, and that also they're really hard to scare. They don't seem to want to go. But also, Sir Simon is scared by the twins and by Washington and by the fact that the family doesn't seem to react to him, and then he ends up being really melancholy, or Virginia finds him and then she helps him go over to the other side. And we find out what happens to Sir Simon, which is that he was punished by the brothers of his wife, so his wife's brothers, and he was left to starve to death, and then he was secluded in the room. And so the housekeeper tells the family the story at the beginning. They says, you know, we've never seen Mr. Sir Simon, we don't know what happened to him, and he's like hidden away in a secret room in this home, and apparently he was left there to starve by his wife's brothers. So the discovery of his body and the burial of it is just part of him being at peace, and then the story moves forward. It's just lovely. The story itself, the plot is very, you know, there's hunting, but then it switches, like there's this almost plot twist, right? Because we have the perspective of the ghost, and we have the perspective of the ghost of Canterville, the Canterville ghost, how he tries to haunt the Otis family. And then we have this romance in there. We have the Duke of Cheshire in love with Virginia. And then we have this, you know, the sort of tropes and themes that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But the plot itself is very simple. It is very fairy tale-esque. It has a happy ending, and there is this wonderful sort of message to the story as well about love, death, and life, and repentance and forgiveness, right? Which is another one of the themes of the story. So we'll talk about some of these themes. First of all, I think the most obvious and the most prevalent in the story is the fight of like the old world versus the new world. I wouldn't call it a fight because, well, at the beginning, yes, because they're always sort of, you know, clashing, because the English are like, you know, we have our ghost, and obviously they react to this ghost, and the Canterville ghost tells us about all the hauntings that he has done throughout his 300 years haunting Canterville Chase. But we have the Otis family, who, yes, are American and they represent American values, but they also represent this like modern world, right? So the modern world that allows us to have more information, to have more remedies, to access new things. And, you know, it would be the equivalent of a ghost trying to haunt someone who has access to like Google and who can order something and be like, oh, you know, there's a blood stain, so I'm gonna erase it. And it's just clean it. And, you know, I have the twins building, you know, the sort of mechanical, or not mechanical, but this creative ghost, which is made of a turnip head, which is very Halloween, sort of reminiscent of like the pumpkin head. So that they're, you know, this very modernized family who has accepted sort of the supernatural, and they're not afraid of it, and they think you can get rid of everything, and they think you can pay and get rid of stuff. And, you know, they represent this sort of modern world that is more aware of things, and it's more practical. While the English are sort of represented with like superstition and things like that. And very sensitive, very sensible, sorry. So very sensible to the supernatural, and to like the past and the influence of the past. Eventually the ghost itself, so the Canterville ghost to me represents the past. It represents history, and it's interesting to me because he obviously has done all these performances, right, as a ghost throughout his life, but he represents, well, into his afterlife, right? But he represents the past. And one part of, I think, the significance of the stain, and then like the housekeeper, she's like, we try to clean it, but it never comes off. I feel like they never try to clean it because he's like, you know, it's hard to find blood, and so he seems to be always replacing it. But I feel like a part of the ghost, it's like the cooperation with the people he's haunting. And I feel like the housekeeper has been living with the ghost and the influence of the ghost. And she probably tried to clean the blood stain once, but then left it there. And it is a reminiscence of what happened there, obviously the murder, but it's also a remembrance of something that happened in the past, like a snapshot of the previous family who lived there. Obviously, it's a tragedy and obviously it's a horrible thing, but I think it is significant in the sense of, you know, there are other elements, for example, like it almost seems like Sir Simon has this like closet of paraphernalia upstairs. His stage, basically, he's backstage where he prepares for his performances. But also Sir Simon has like his he has his moments, are very, very, very brief, very subtle, but there's a moment where he's like looking at the pictures of like the family, right? And you have like photographs of the Otis family, and he's looking at them, and they have replaced the Canterville photos, right? And I feel like this moment has significant value as well, of like he is at Canterville, he is part of the family, and this is his home too, and they have just sort of changed everything. So there's some sort of sympathy for Sir Simon, and also that the suit of armor belonged to him. So it's like a remembrance of like, this is my house, I was here, I lived here, and he stayed there. And in the end, obviously Wilde talks about the fact that, you know, you have to bury the past and you have to move forward. But it talks about the sort of nostalgia and the memories we have for the past, and the people who lived before us, and the histories that are still living with us, right? Whether it is our families or the memories that we're making, or the families that we're creating, or they're perpetuating, it comes with that. So it was interesting because instead of just being like this perpetual curse or something, of like the sins of the father, there are the sins of Sir Simon, but him as a ghost haunting Canterville Chase, it seems more like this is my home, right? Because like that's his suit of armor, and the hauntings are just his memories of his afterlife there. And the blood stain is part of something that he did, but it's almost like a remember me, right? Like, don't forget about me, don't forget what I did, more than, you know, a sort of curse or a sin, right? Because he's the one who's keeping the stain there. So it's not like the stain is part of like the memories of the house and the curse of like the ancestors, right? But he's like, he's keeping it there. He's theatrically putting it there. And he doesn't care if it's not blood red, right? Because, you know, it talks about how the paint changes, right? And he's been stealing Virginia's paints, and one day the blood is emerald green, and she's like, blood is not emerald green. And he's like, it's really hard to get blood. So you see that he's making an effort, right, to create this scene, but it's like he doesn't want to be forgotten. He wants to be made aware that he's there, right? And I sort of love that. So it's part of that old world, but seen in this sort of melancholy, nostalgic lens of like, let's not let go of it yet, but we still have to bury it and move forward, right? Because at the end of the story, even though Mr. Otis is reluctant, Virginia marries the Duke. So it's like the bringing of both worlds together through love. So it's a very beautiful sort of ending, of like, let's bring the worlds together through love, and sort of bury the past. And even though the past is filled with tragedy and murder and sins. And that's the second theme of the novel. The big theme of the story is forgiveness, right? And redemption. I feel like redemption is a big theme for many Gothic novels. And I feel like it's very prevalent in this, and I think might have something to do with like the past that many cultures have, that it's very filled with blood, and colonization is not a pretty thing to look at. So when he talks about his own sins, and the only way is that the young people will forgive, and they will unite and build a new future with like love, and instead of more death, more blood, more more destroying, more bad things, right? So I think it's very beautiful. Obviously, you can forgive, and I feel like that's a very personal choice, but the story talks about that. Like, the story obviously focuses on that, and the fact that Sir Simon was not a good man. Obviously he killed his wife, but also like all the stories that he tells us about the hauntings, some of them ended with people going mad or people suffering. So his actions did have consequences, and it felt like almost like the twins pranking the ghost, right? So there were consequences on him as well. So it's like he wasn't able to see that, he wasn't able to care about them. And so, he wasn't always a good person, but he ends up being forgiven, and that's what helps him go to heaven or get some peace. And I feel like that's really beautiful and important. And obviously he goes through this sort of trial where he atones for his sins. So he asks for forgiveness, and he's like, I'm ready to go. I think I'm done. And he's not getting any joy anymore from hunting. And again, like I said, I feel like part of the hunting for the Canterville ghost is about being remembered and not being forgotten. And because the blood stain and the people being scared sort of keeps the memory of Sir Simon alive. But eventually you have to let it rest. And I feel like that's part of the process here. Another big theme for me is also decadence in art history. So Oscar Wilde was a part of the movement of the decadence, or the aesthetic movement. And to summarize, because there's a lot of complicated aspects of it, but it was a movement that declared that you make art for art's sake, right? And so it means about making art, but it's also about political and politicizing things, because art is political. And of course, there are some sort of hints here and there, because there's Lord Canterville. I knew I was gonna say Canterbury at some point. So there's Lord Canterville, and there's, the minister. He's a political figure. There's the Duke of Cheshire, and then there's this, middle class figure who owns or is purchasing a home of like an English family. So obviously there is some sort of political aspects to it, but the idea here is art for art's sake, and it is about art and artistry, and the ghost is an artist. He's a theater person. He's an actor, basically. So he's performing the roles of many different ghosts. So he's like, the headless vampire, and the friar, or the cowboy, or I don't know. So he keeps playing these roles, and he dresses, and he there's this detail that Oscar Wilde puts in this sort of decadence of like dressing, and the aesthetic of the ghost, and the aesthetic of how he looks, and how he chooses his clothes and his like accessories to scare the children, or to scare Washington. And so you have all of that. And Virginia is also an artist, so there's an interest connection between them, which is what helps them eventually, have this moment in the end, right? So it helps her understand him, because they're both artists, and she's a painter. She tells him like, I love to just paint sunsets, and you're stealing all my paintings. And she talks about art creating this reaction. So you're making art, you're making beautiful art, but art has a reaction on the viewer, on the reader, on the audience. And she says, I love to paint sunsets, and you're stealing all my colors, all of the reds, all of the vibrant colors, and now you're only leaving me with like the grays, and I can only do like moonlight scenes, and they're all melancholy, and they're all sad. And this sort of reflects on the emotional state of both Virginia and the Canterville ghost. So I think there's an interesting connection. But yes, there's definitely this like hint to art and decadence, and of course, talking about the it is a way for us to look at the ghost as this kind of character who's an actor, who's a performer, who's performing. And it's such an interesting version of a ghost, I feel, because he is like clearly getting on this part, and there are consequences to art, right? Because it is an expression of his artistic endeavors, but it ends up making people go crazy or scaring them, or it has this like visceral reaction. While Virginia talks about it and talks about art, like the sunsets making people happy, and then the moon scenes that are making people sad. So I think that talks about like the connection between art and feeling and emotion, and making art for just the pleasure of making art. So art for art's sake, basically, and talk about the stories. And if you ever feel like you want to know more about the decadence and the movement, you can read the preface to The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is fantastic and amazing. But I feel like he has hints of his own personality, his own decadent movement in the story as well, with these characters. And I think that's what makes them really special, I feel, both Virginia and the ghost. And so finally I wanted to talk about my impressions of it. And so those were like the overarching themes, I feel. Obviously the old versus the new world, I think, is the most important. And that connection of the Otis family with like this modern world of like they have these solutions for everything, like, hey, here's this oil that will help your chains so they don't make so much noise, and it ends up helping him because he's chained to the wall, which is why he wasn't able to get food, and it works, it helps. And as I understood, part of it was like his skeleton moving around the house, which I thought was really fascinating as well. So it's like his skeleton sort of moving around the house, and the skeleton that was left was the ghost itself. So it was like a physical presence, basically, which was his skeleton sort of coming to life. Because that's what I felt was the Canterville ghost. It was like his skeleton because he had like the rattling chain. And that part, like when they come in and he's like, oh, use the oil. And then there is this part where he's like, doing his maniacal laughter. And then Lucretia comes in, or Mrs. Otis comes in, and she's like, oh, here's this like tincture for your belly if you're having like indigestion problems, like it's okay. And it looked, I honestly wanted like them to live happily with the ghost, so that was really cute. There's like, oh, now I'm feeling better. So I thought that was really good, and it was really interesting. And it was like, it was satirical, obviously, but I don't know if it was like the Otis family were, trying to, because he says like, oh, he's been living here for 300 years and these kids are just throwing pillows at him. Like, that's disrespectful. And I feel like that's showing some sort of respect for the past as well. And a type of trying to understand the past. And I think that eventually is what leads to the atonement of whatever sins, plague the family. So I talked about last week about the haunted house motif in Gothic novels, and the reason for a house being haunted, for the most part, besides like a deep connection between the owner and the house itself, is that there is a sin hiding or living in there, and that needs to be atoned for, right? So there is this sin that lives in there that keeps repeating itself. So it is the sin of an ancestor that keeps coming back because it's something that hasn't been solved, right? And in the case of the Canterville ghost, it is through the goodness of this new occupants who are trying to like kind of help this ghost be like, hey, we're all gonna live here, so we're all gonna live here in peace, if we're all gonna share this space, So, if you think about the Otis families, like immigrants, and the ghost has been there for longer, be like, hey, we're all going to share this space. Then let us help you with like our modern, tinctures and help. And let us help you, have a quiet chains and, not wail at night so malevolently. Let us help you, and then we can all sort of live together, because we can sleep in peace, and then you can just retire to your rooms. And obviously there's a sense of like moving forward after that. And I think that's what helps atone for the sin, which is part of like that, the thing that Oscar Wilde said about love, right? So it's like love is stronger than death, and in the fact that if we're just kind, if we're just kind to one another, and it's part of the whole of love that leads to forgiveness, that leads to transcending, right? So when Virginia finds this like ghost being very melancholy, she reaches out to him and they have a conversation and they're able to talk, so the ghost is not trying to hunt them, and the family is not trying to hunt him back. So like the twins are not trying to like get at him. So it's just having a conversation, having like a decent conversation where he can say, hey, listen, I'm just waiting for someone to expiate this sin and to pray for forgiveness, because I can't do that for myself. And I thought that was really interesting, because then you have to have someone, pray for you. And that sort of helps with it transcending to this other plane, right? To being able to rest and have some peace, and the sins of like this family to be forgiven. So I thought that was really cool. Finally, I think what I'm most fascinated with, of course, the ghost. It was so amazing. He's so Dickensian to me because he's so theatrical, so I thought that was really amazing. There's just something very beautiful about a theatrical ghost. My favorite, of course, was like the intricate connection between like the fairy tale elements and the Gothic revival. So it is a fairy tale, but it's a Gothic fairy tale. It's not based on horror or terror, but it's based on the love and the story and the past, and sort of it's well done, right? So it's not based on like goriness or horror, but it's satirical, so it's funny, but it's also working on your feelings, because it is melancholy and it has a lot of like really interesting elements that Oscar Wilde plays with. So my theory is that because the 19th century saw so much technological advance, that it drew people, because it was so much so quickly, right? It was like the printing press and the train, right? So like the ability to get to a place faster, and now you have the telegraph, and then you have the photographs, and then you have like ways of communicating with people that you didn't have before, because you had like the post and it took 2 weeks or whatever, and now you were able to send a message almost instantly to someone else via telegraph, and then you could take a snapshot. So it wasn't like a family portrait, but it was like really expensive, and it was a show of like privilege and wealth, but it was like a photograph that some people could afford, not everybody obviously, but many people could afford, and it took an instantaneous picture. And of course, with the advancements in technology also come the trying to debunk things and trying to you have advances, for example, in medicine, right? And those are good because now we know that germs exist, and now we know that you have antibiotics, and that can heal an infection. Now people don't die from a fever, so that's good. Now we know that we don't have to like bleed every single patient, and that if you like actually let the sunlight in and air a room, that's actually healthier than keeping people in, right? So we're learning these things in the 19th century, but that means that a lot of the beliefs that people had from a long time ago were being debunked, right? So this is like the theories and the way your mother and your grandmother and your great-grandmother were healing people. And now all of a sudden it's like, no, this is not valid anymore, because now we know about germs. So, we can't do the things that we did the same anymore, and like now, before people couldn't rely on doctors. Now you can, because they can travel, right? And now you have like great detectives that come and solve crimes, and they have like detection, things. And then you have phrenology, so you can read people's heads and you can discover if this person is like meant for crime. So you have all of these things that are making a big hit, and they're trying to challenge the way that you've lived your whole life, right? So it is the modern world, and then you go to like America, and then you can go and you can make your fortune, and then people would come from America or the United States to England with a lot of money, and they would mix with English families with wealth, like the Otis family marrying the Duke of Cheshire, like, Virginia Otis marrying the Duke of Cheshire. And so you have this, like, you don't have this perpetuation of like only royalty anymore. You have these Americans and that don't have the same, finishing schools, and they don't have the same sort of proper ladies training that a lot of the English girls had. So you have these different ideas, right? And they're challenging the way you see the world, because other people are living differently, and then you're getting together, and then you're sharing and changing. So my theory is that, of course, because of all of this advancement that happens so quickly, people clung almost with melancholy and with a desire of of like nostalgia, right, to what brought them this kind of joy before. So fairy tales, folk tales, mysteries, and ghost stories. I think that's the reason why ghost stories were so prevalent in the 19th century. It was not just the fascination with death, but it was a fascination with the past and the mysteries to uncover, and with this idea of our ancestors and the things that were done before, and how we can solve the problems now with what we have now. We can solve problems from the past. Does that make sense? So how this modern family like the Otis can come in and solve this mystery that apparently none of the Cantervilles tried to solve in all of the 300 years. And with their tinctures and their modern things, they're able to connect to this past, and even to solve or help with the ghost, and sort of solve these problems, if that makes sense, and get to this kind of happy agreement. So it's a really interesting thing. But if you think about it, the 19th century saw the revival of so many things, and it saw the revival of the fairy tale. So we had access to many fairy tales, and this drawing to sort of childhood happiness, and the folk tale. Because what is a fairy tale after all? A fairy tale started as a folk tale or an oral tale. So it was part of the oral tradition from the countryside, from going to, if you read like the Pickwick Papers or the early Dickens, right? Because Dickens sees a lot of this transformation from like, London, for example, and what happens as the trains are coming in, and the railways and the industry, and how all of that changes London. And he talks about, he brings a lot of fairy tales, I feel, because he really, thinks back to, his childhood, but also like this fantastical sort of world that existed before. In this world of oral telling, where you believe someone, you would go to a pub. So if you read like the Pickwick Papers, you would go to a pub, and as you were traveling, because it took you longer, because before the railway system, right, before trains, before the locomotive, you had to travel by carriage. So it would take you days to reach your destination. So you would stop at a pub, and you would get dinner, you get a drink, and then a stranger would be there, and then you would talk. And then what would you talk about? You would talk about folk tales, fairy tales, and they were mixed, right? Because I feel like every single folk tale, it's like gossip, but it always had this element of the supernatural, because when you want to tell a story, you want to make it interesting. But also it is about like the ghosts that belong to a place, because something that fascinates me about ghosts is that they belong somewhere, right? So they are part of the history of a certain place, and they belong to this place. So when someone tells a ghost story, they'll be like, oh, I stayed in the room in this inn, right? So they're like telling the story about this particular place. And when you talk about this like gossip, the more you talk about, it's like the telephone game, right? So the more you tell the story, the more embellished it gets, the more interesting it gets, and the more fantastical it gets, right? And so when you have the Pickwick Papers, there's a story, for example, about the chair that transforms into a man, and then you can't sleep in that room because it feels like there's a man sitting in that chair. And then there's other stories about their ghost stories, right? And so Dickens is talking about his own experiences traveling the country as a young reporter, staying at pubs and listening to his folk tales. They are fantastical, and they're about ghosts, and they're sort of creepy because you have to draw your reader in, right? And your audience in, and you have to add the sort of mystery of like, ooh, and I was staying there, and everybody's like, oh. And ghost stories and fairy tales are like that, because if you think about the original fairy tales before, Hans Christian Andersen and the Grimm brothers, because Dickens talks about this, right? He says like, when I loved Little Red Riding Hood, she gets eaten by the wolf, and it is a cautionary tale. It is like a ghost story, because the majority of ghost stories are cautionary tales. They're tales about like, don't be in this place at midnight, or don't go in there because there's a ghost. And usually the ghost tries to warn or tell a story, because that's what ghosts do. They're at least in like Victorian fiction that we've read, and then the short stories, the ghost stories, they're there to tell a story, right? What do? They sit there and they tell a story. Like if you think about the one that we read from The Tale of Two Idle Apprentices, right? The ghost just sits there and tells Dickens a story, and he's like, I'm doomed to tell my story, because that's what ghosts do. They tell stories. They can only scare you because of how they look, but then, really they can't, physically do anything to you. They can just scare you, which of course has consequences, but at the end of the day, they are the story, and the story works as a cautionary tale of like, careful with whom you get married, and don't let curiosity win, don't talk to strangers. And that's exactly what fairy tales do, right? So fairy tales are cautionary tales. At their core, they're folk tales about like how this young lady lost her innocence because she was talking to strangers in the road, and there was the wolf, and she told him where she was going, and he ended up going there and getting to her and to her grandmother, right? So that's Little Red Riding Hood. And Dickens talks about how like the Grimm brothers introduced like the huntsman who saved Little Red. And again, the more they're being transmitted, the more they're changing, the more they're becoming, they're being transformed into something else. So there's something magical about fairy tales, is that they're always being transformed, changed, reinterpreted, reinvented, because we always go back to them. We still do. We're still making fairy tales. And there's something fascinating about them. And the more we advance in society, the more we sort of cling. Have you noticed this? Like there was a time in our lives where we had so much development, right? Like I think in the 2000s, wasn't it? Like that time where we have like computers and iPhones and printers and the DVD, and then you had like the DVD, but then you had the Blu-ray, and then you have the Walkman, and then the Discman, right? And then you have like the CD, and now you have MP3, and now you have like your phone, and that's it. So there came this time with like so much invention, and what did we go back to? We went back to fairy tales. What did Disney do when he had the opportunity to make animated films? Fairy tales. What do we always do? It's like a rom-com, a ghost story, and a fairy tale. It's always like something that we go back to, and I feel like it's really interesting at this time of like great invention, when the world is changing so quickly, so fast. Like you have the telegraph, and then you have photographs, and then you have this, and you have information, because now books are accessible to you. Before, books were like riches, you have to have money to have books, and now you have books by the printing press, and you have knowledge, and you have access to things, and now you can learn how to read. And being read to, right? And so you have this ability to be informed, to learn more. And what happened is that we go back and we cling to sort of supernatural, to fantasy, and we look for ghost stories, and because it is a sort of reminiscence of the past. This is why mesmerism happened, where people were, believing it was a science. It was a science. It was considered a science. There was a scientific procedure surrounding it, but it was about contacting the dead, or having a conversation with the dead. And with science, with experiments, comes that idea of like still looking for the supernatural, still trying to explain things that we can't explain, because I think that there are things that you can't explain in this world, and we still sort of try to look for it. And so today, I think we've hit this sort of wall where we're constantly challenged by the inventions that we've made, right? Because we want to believe in ghosts, but we always have this like questioning of like, oh, but Google, or you have a camera, you have a photo, so you have this like rationalization happening at all times. Whereas I think back in the 17th century, in the 18th century, even the 16th century, people would say like, oh, there was a dragon, there was a zombie, and nobody would question it. You know what I mean? Like you read something like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, or you read Beowulf, and you're like, oh, there was a dragon there once, and that was lore, and that was folk, right? And it was a folk story, an oral tale, and nobody questioned it, because nobody could Google and be like, is Beowulf real? Nobody could do that. Everybody sort of heard the story, and it became part of their lives. It became part of who they were. And so people, probably like Dickens, heard the story of Little Red Riding Hood and thought she was real, and thought she was like a real person. Before he grew up, before he understood what it was to be fiction. And I think there's something interesting about that as well, because the printing press created that accessibility to fiction, right? Because Jane Eyre is a proof of this, right? Because when Charlotte Bronte published Jane Eyre, she published it as an autobiography, because those were the kinds of stories people were always looking for, this sort of autobiographical story. And with the dawn of the Gothic came that fantasy, right? That sort of let's create something else, like escapism, something that's not realism, something that's not an autobiography, something that's fictional. And so Jane Eyre stands in that in-between place of like people still wanting to read this like biographical stories, or stories from like the real world, or realistic stories. Like, Jane Eyre would be considered something like that. It's like, yes, it is fiction, but it's based on the real. It doesn't have vampires, werewolves, or, supernatural creatures. It doesn't have ghosts, is what I'm saying. It doesn't have like supernatural things that you question. It's a story that's real. It's a story that, Northanger Abbey is like Gothic, but it doesn't have a ghost in it. So it is centered in its realism, right? And it is a parody of things like, Anne Radcliffe and Clara Reeve, who were writing these fantastical stories. But even they were trying to like adjust to the reality and have like, oh, it was something that horrified the characters, but it has to center in reality, right? So with the Canterville ghost, that shit goes away, right? Because it is a story that does not question the ghost at all. The ghost is completely real. Actually, he's very vibrantly alive, right? Because he gets a cold from when the twins wet him with like the water trick, the water prank. He falls down the stairs when the twins, I don't know what they did, they buttered the stairwell, I have no idea. So he has this like very physical reactions to the world around him. He's very real, and I think that is this sort of conglomeration of like the fairy tale and the Gothic revival, and Oscar Wilde, because he was a little bit later in the 19th century, like after Dickens, after Collins. He has that, grasp of both, like the fairy tale revival and the Gothic revival, and how they both worked. And, his books and his stories don't try to like, justify, or, many of the writers who are, considered respectable, like Collins, like Dickens, would damp their toes in the possibility of a supernatural, right? So they would have these things like could be real or couldn't be real, right? So you have characters like Miss Havisham, who's sort of borderline realistic, and she has a lot of aspects about her that aren't realistic, but they were drawn to I think readers were drawn to that kind of fiction, fantasy. And the more advances they were seeing, the more fiction they were demanding, right? The more they were consuming this penny dreadfuls, these fairy tales, because they sounded like folk tales, because they had this melancholy and nostalgic throwback to the past. They were ghosts that they were revisiting, right? So these ghost stories, these fairy tales were being consumed, right? And many authors would write anonymously about these ghost stories, and you have so many of them, because you have when you realize how many authors publish Gothic stories or ghost stories, and then you realize the popularity of them at the time, we also realized that there was, if they were writing it's because people were reading them. And to me, the interest is in this sort of search for the fantastical, kind of like how mesmerism was a science, and kind of like how people were believing the Fox sisters when they were doing their tappings and saying that they were talking to ghosts. How all of that becomes part of accepting or dealing with all of this modern world, and that modern world versus old world, and how we're adjusting to all of the technological advances and all of the things from the time that they were changing so quickly, and how we're drawn to that, how we're drawn to fantasy. That's my argument in the end. We're drawn to fantasy in the end to cope with the reality. So fantasy, it is needed, so you need that ghost story, you need that fairy tale in order to better understand the reality around you, because it was through Little Red Riding Hood that many of us learned not to talk to strangers, right? And many fairy tales come with that moral. Many ghost stories and Gothic novels come with morals too. They come with this, the Canterville Ghost, right? With this moral, this message, right? About love being stronger than death, and forgiveness being stronger than anything. And it is a beautiful message, and it is fairy tale-esque, right? Because the young woman is rewarded, and she gets, to marry her prince, if you will. And there is this promise of an afterlife and forgiveness for your sins. So it is really much like a fairy tale, right? But it has this Gothic motif. And I think that Gothic novels also have the kind of moral in the end. I do feel so. I feel like fairy tales and Gothic stories are very similar. That's why a lot of fairy tales are Gothic, and because they have a little darkness in them, but they also have this hopefulness. But it's in the darkness there is something that eventually we can learn from it, or you can come out through the other side, right? So you can go through the belly of the wolf, if you will, and then come back at the other side. And that's why a lot of fairy tales have happy endings, but a lot of them don't. And if you think about Bluebeard, there is a story where the sister is saved by her brothers, but there's also a story in which she is also killed by her husband. And in the end, the story is always seen as this sort of be careful with your curiosity, but also be careful with whom you love. So it depends on who tells a story, but you can get this moral from it, right? So Gothic novels, I feel, are the same. So if you read The House of Seven Gables, The Fall of the House of Usher, whatever story that you read has this message that it wants to tell you. And I think the supernatural really helps, because the ghost is that warning. The ghost represents that, right? So the Canterville ghost represents that that sins can be forgiven, that you can be redeemed, and he represents that link to the past, and that sort of link to fantastical characters, right? So he has this strong connection with all of these legends and lore and fairy tales. And at the end of the story, even though we have a modern ending, even though we have this connection of the old and the new, right? Because we have like the Duke marrying Virginia, you have this old and the new world finding love and getting together. And then the Duke talks about her children. He tells her, he tells Virginia, I hope you tell the children what happened to you in that room. And so now we're going back to the origin, to folk tales and fairy tales. We're going back to a mother telling their kids bedtime stories. We're going back to the nurse telling children bedtime stories. We're going back to that tradition, that exchange of stories, and as an act of love, and how the ghost of Canterville is alive through Virginia and the stories that she tells of him. Hopefully with now a light of redemption, but he's still alive and he's still living through that story. Like, he doesn't have to keep the stain alive. He doesn't have to wear the armor again. He doesn't have to spook anyone in order to be remembered. Now he will be remembered through the stories of Virginia and the stories her children would tell their children about what Virginia went through. Does that make sense? So in that note, I think we'll leave it there because it's a happy note. Let me know what you think about the story. Let me know what you think about my analysis of it. What do you think is the importance? Where are we drawn so much to fairy tales, folk tales, ghost stories, especially in times of great invention and great, very quick changes? What is it that draws us back to like ghosts and fairies and elves and the supernatural? What is that call that they give us? Why are we drawn to them? That's one of my great interest in this kind of literature. So let me know what you think. Stay spooky, have fun, and I'll see you soon. Bye.